Good afternoon. This is Dr. Helms, and our topic for today in 212 is sexuality in the context of relationships. Please remember to read Chapter 5 from the Knox and Chat textbook that is posted in Blackboard. It provides a very good background for the topic that we're going to be covering today in lecture. I'd like to start with this great quote that appears on slide 1 that really captures some of the anxiety that parents have in families when it comes to talking to their children about sex or beginning to help them understand the role of sexuality in the context of relationships. You know your children are growing up when they stop asking you where they came from and they refuse to tell you where they're going. So regarding what we are going to cover today in the online portion of our lecture, I want you to refer to the list here on the overview slide, and the topics that are followed by an asterisk are the topics that we're going to cover in our online portion of the lecture today, and the remaining topics will be covered in class on Tuesday. So in terms of an overview of what we're going to be covering in the lecture, we're going to first begin with a brief overview of trends in sexual attitudes and behaviors and how our attitudes actually link with or fail to link with our role behavior when we are looking specifically at sexuality in close relationships. Next, we're going to move into a discussion of premarital sex trends in the United States as well as trends in terms of frequency, etc. in marital sex in the United States. The next topic in our online lecture will focus on how to teach parents how to talk to their children about sex. This is often a topic that parents have a lot of dread about, anxiety, and uncertainty. And what we're going to do in this class is provide both general guidelines as well as very specific guidelines that follow a developmental approach. In class on Tuesday, we'll begin by an overview of general guidelines that you can pass on to parents in parent education programs. And then we're going to move into a discussion of sexual activity that occurs outside of marriage. We're going to then focus and highlight a study of marital sex, and it's one of the few cross-cultural studies that have been done. And finally, we're going to close out our discussion of sexuality in close relationships by taking a close look at prerequisites for a healthy sexual relationship. And you'll also find some of that topic covered more extensively in your book. Sexual attitudes and behavior. Regarding the first point, we've certainly been able to document shifts towards more permissive attitudes and behaviors in the U.S. regarding sexuality, particularly during the latter half of the 20th century. In studies of married individuals that have been conducted recently, we see that over 90% of men and 85% of women report having engaged in sexual intercourse before their wedding. And I'll repeat that. In recent studies of married individuals, 90% of men and 85% of women report having engaged in sexual intercourse before their wedding. In addition, studies that have been done over time of different cohorts of individuals in the United States have documented a shift in attitudes, particularly regarding values of chastity as a priority in selecting a relationship partner. So we've seen that in the 1930s, the 1940s, chastity was a highly valued attribute in a partner, and we've seen the value of chastity dropping in the ranks among young adults and college students specifically. The second point addresses attitudes versus our role behavior in our sexual relationships. Attitudes versus role behavior. Now, my comments here should take you back a little bit to our discussion of gender roles and gender role attitudes and beliefs and stereotypes and how they play out in our close relationships. So while we've been able to document that there's been a trend towards more liberal or tolerant attitudes about sexuality and more specifically about sexual behavior outside of marital relationships, What we've seen in terms of role behavior in heterosexual close relationships is what researchers refer to as sex-typed or sex-typed sexual scripts that are enacted, and these are enacted along gendered lines, and I'm going to repeat that. In research that actually looks at the behavioral exchanges that men and women engage in their heterosexual sexual close relationships, they find what they call sex-typed sexual scripts, and these behaviors are gendered. So, for example, scholars talk about women serving as gatekeepers for sexual behavior in relationships. And what they mean here is that women are very often viewed to be responsible for whether or not sex will actually occur, because women are viewed to be responsible for setting sexual boundaries and limits. And very often women report feeling more ambivalence than men do when they do have sex outside of marriage. So despite the documented changes and shifts towards more liberal or tolerant attitudes in the United States, when you actually look inside individuals' close sexual relationships, we do see some evidence for sex-type sexual scripts in which women are viewed to be the gatekeepers of sexual activity, and women experience ambivalence or report more ambivalence than men do regarding their sexual activity outside of marriage. Within this same body of research, we found that men are expected and it's viewed to be more appropriate for men to initiate sex than women. And again, this is a gendered pattern where there's often an expectation in relationships that it's more appropriate for men to initiate sexual activity than it is women. Let's move on to understanding sexual relationships in the context of HIV and AIDS. With the prevalence of AIDS, college student attitudes about sex have included fear, and specifically fear of contracting HIV. We also see in this context college students endorsing beliefs regarding the importance of being selective in choosing sexual partners, as well as beliefs that support safer sex practices. And I'll repeat that. In the advent of HIV and AIDS, we see college student attitudes about sex including support for safer sex, support for the importance of selectivity in sex partners, and also fear, the feeling of fear, specifically fear regarding contracting HIV. Although more and more adolescents are using contraception and adopting safer sex practices when they do have sex, the most consistent changes in sexual practices towards safer sex have occurred for middle-aged homosexual men. So even though we see an endorsement of safer sex practices by most young adults and teens, we actually see behaviorally the most consistent changes in safer sex practices among middle-aged homosexual men. Also, to further put this in context, I wanted to provide you with some prevalence information that, and this is from data that was published in the 2008-2010 period. Young people aged 13 to 24 make up about 17% of all people in the United States diagnosed with HIV and AIDS at that time point. So if you're looking at young people, teenagers and young adults, they make up about 17% of all people diagnosed with HIV and AIDS. Now, looking at a slightly older group, 15 to 24-year-olds, although 15 to 24-year-olds represent only 1/4 of the sexually active population in the United States, so 15 to 24-year-olds represent about 25% of the people who are sexually active in the U.S., they account for nearly half of the new cases of sexually transmitted infections each year. So here we're looking a little bit more broadly than HIV and AIDS and looking at STIs. And we know that although 15 and 24-year-olds represent only 1/4 of the sexually active population, they account for nearly half of the new STI infections reported each year. HPV infections are pretty prevalent among this age group, and that's why you see a lot of public health efforts geared towards college students as well as pediatricians' offices for vaccinations for younger children. HPV, These specific infections account for about half of the STIs diagnosed among the 15 to 24-year-olds each year. HPV infections account for about half of the STIs diagnosed among 15 to 24-year-olds each year. It's extremely common, it's often asymptomatic, and certain types, if left undetected and untreated, lead to cervical cancer in women. So what about contraceptive use? I'm going to report some findings based on the way that researchers ask the questions, because they ask questions in slightly different ways in these very large national data sets. So one of the ways that researchers ask about contraception use and frequency of use is to ask individuals to think back to their first sexual encounter and report their contraceptive use. And then they also will ask them to reflect on their most recent sexual encounter. So I'm going to tell you a few different statistics regarding these specific ways of reporting. The use of contraceptions during first premarital sex has been increasing in teens. So that's a good behavioral change that we're seeing in teens. We've seen it was 56% contraceptive use among women who first had premarital sex in the 1980s. So 56%, right around 1985, of women reported using contraception during their first premarital sex. And then if you look to the period of time between 2000 and 2004, 76% of women reported using contraception for their first premarital sex. And then if you move to the 2005-2008 period, 84% of women reported using contraception during their first sex. This is very good news because a sexually active teen who does not use contraception has over a 90% chance of becoming pregnant within a year. A sexually active teen who does not use contraception has over a 90% chance of becoming pregnant within a year. The condom is the most common contraceptive method used at first intercourse. So when you ask teenagers and young adults, what did you use the first time that you had sex, most of them report a condom. 68% of females and 80% of males use a condom the first time they have sex. In 2006 to 2010, if we look at this last bullet on the slide, reports for most recent sexual encounters, in 2006 to 2010, approximately 86% of female teens and 93% of male teens reported using contraceptive use the last time they had sex. So in 2006 to 2010, about 86% of female teens and 93% of male teens reported using some form of contraception at last sex. These proportions reported in 2006 to 2010 actually represent a marked improvement since 1995, when only 71% of female teens and 82% of male teens had reported using any form of contraceptive method at last sex. So these proportions that are reported for 2006 and 2010, where you have 86% of female teens and 93% of male teens using contraception, that is an improvement over 1995, when only 71% of female teens and 82% of male teens had reported using a contraceptive method at last sex. However, the proportion remained unchanged between 2002 and that 2006-2010 period. So some public health officials say we want to get those rates of use up even higher. We'd like to see it much closer to 100% of use. And public health officials have taken a new slant to try to encourage teens to use contraception, because what they've found in a variety of studies is that teens and young adults who do use contraception for their first sexual intercourse also report that their sexual experience itself was more positive than those teens or young adults who didn't use contraception. So one of the slants the public health officials have been taking is to promote this idea that the use of contraception is also linked to a more satisfying sexual experience among youth. Okay, For this last slide in section 1 of the lecture, I want to go over some prevalent statistics regarding premarital sex in the United States. And I first want to let you know where this information is coming from because it comes from a variety of sources, but pretty much across these sources you get a very similar story emerging. So some of this data comes from the National Survey of Family Growth, some from the Centers for Disease Control, some from the National Center for Health Statistics, the AdHealth Survey, and the National Health and Social Life Survey. So all of these surveys are taking a look at Americans. They're nationally representative samples. They have representation from individuals from all ethnicities, social classes, and races. So first, what is the average age in the United States for first intercourse? Across these studies, you get slight variations in the exact number, but what we know across the studies, a consistent finding that emerges is that the average age is right around between 17 and 18 years old. One specific study gives 17.7 years old. So the average age at first intercourse for most Americans is right around 17.7, 18 years old. Regarding whether first intercourse occurs within or outside of marriage, we know that first sexual intercourse is premarital for approximately 83% of individuals who participated in these studies. We know that for the majority of individuals who participated in these studies, their first sexual intercourse was premarital outside of marriage. Another interesting finding that's specific to reports from married individuals is that the majority of married young adults have had sex with someone other than their spouse currently. The majority of married young adults, it's right around 70%, 67 to 70%, have had sex with someone other than their spouse. Another finding that's reported in the literature is that approximately 11% of individuals report remaining abstinent until marriage. About 11% of individuals who eventually did get married report that they remained abstinent until they got married, meaning they didn't have sexual intercourse until they married. And finally, the last point on the slide is that 22% of the individuals surveyed reported that they had sexual intercourse only with the person that they eventually married. So they did engage in premarital sex, so they are part of that 83% premarital, but 22% of those individuals reported that they did have sexual intercourse only with the person that they eventually married.